Hey guys, this is Phil Galfond for BlueFirePoker.com. I'm happy to welcome you back to my philosophy series. Um, it's been a while, but to those of you who don't know or remember, it's not a series you need to watch in order. Basically, each video is just me exploring a concept a little bit in depth. This is episode 5, and I titled it How to Exploit a Range, or How to Not Exploit a Range. This is a concept that I think it's understood amongst a lot of high-stakes players, and even a lot of mid-stakes players. So it's nothing, I think, nothing groundbreaking, but it's something that if it's not something you understand or not something you think about, I think it's extremely important to think about and to understand. So, for some of you, this may just be a review, but I really thought this was important to talk about, just in case, for the Bluefire members that haven't been thinking about this, because I think it's, an extremely important part of logical deduction, which is like a huge part of adjusting to opponents and playing good poker, really. So we start with the problem brought to us by a friend or a student, and he says he's playing heads up no limit, 100 big blind stacks. He says, I'm having trouble on flops against this player A. He's check raising pretty often, but he raises with a range that makes it tough to hero call or fight back. It includes made hands as weak as second pair, some weak draws occasionally, but lots of strong hands and strong draws. It feels like he's doing something wrong because he isn't really pot controlling with anything. He's bloating pots out of position with like weak top pair, strong second pair type hands, and because it contains so many like decent marginal hands and it's 100 big blinds deep out of position, I feel like I should be able to do something about it. But I'm running into trouble when I check raise. When I call his check raise with marginals, or when I try to 3-bet the flop, he's willing to call flop 3-bets somewhat light, and he's willing to 4-bet the stack off somewhat light as well. I feel like I should be able to do something about it, especially when he has so many of these weak top pair and second pair hands in his range, as well as a lot of like marginal flush draws. But basically, he's saying other than waiting for a hand and getting him to stack off, what else can I do about it? How do I exploit this? And my answer is you kind of don't. And I want to start with a hand example to get into this further. So here we are, heads up. We raise the button with 10-6 suited, and he calls. And we see a flop of queen 6-3, 2 spades. We decide to c-bet, and he check raises with the range we've been talking about. I want to talk, like, before looking at just this hand, 10-6 suited, like our friend or student mentioned, like he feels like he should be able to attack boards like this. So with a hand like, let's say we have, just like ace jack of diamonds or something like that, or let's take a worse hand, jack 10 of diamonds with some backdoor draws, or just really any hand. He feels like, against a player with a range like this, which includes like all of his flush draws, which presumably he shouldn't just be getting in any flush draw, and some weaker made hands as well as obviously his stronger made hands. It feels like we should be able to 3-bet bluff occasionally or often, but we've been running into problems because he's been, with his king jack of spades, obviously he's just jamming, and with his jack 8 of spades, he's like calling or jamming. He's not really willing to fold that often, and he's folding occasionally. He's folding some of his weaker draws. He's folding some of his second pair type hands, or he's maybe seeing a turn with them and making a decision from there. He's not folding his top pair hands. So when we're in this spot with weaker hands, we actually, because of his range, it feels like we should be able to fight back, but we're running into a lot of trouble fighting back. And then with a hand like this, with 10-6 suited, with second pair, average kicker. Um, it feels like because he has so many draws in his range, basically almost all of his draws, um, and then he's check raising so frequently, it seems like we want to be able to fight back by at least calling and seeing a turn. But honestly, against his range, I think the best play is just to go ahead and fold right away. And we can look a little bit more in depth at his range and talk about what we can do about it, and what we should be looking to exploit, and why we're having trouble with a hand like 10-6, why we're having trouble with some of our weaker hands that we want to 3-bet bluff or decide to float. So let's take a look at his check raising range. This range is the range we're giving him on all boards, not specifically the Queen 6-3 board. Actually, you'll notice that I have 2 pair here in his check raising range, and on Queen 6-3 he's not going to show up with any 2 pair hands in the big blind because he's not defending Queen 6 suited or 6-3 suited or Queen 3 suited. But essentially, obviously on certain boards it's not going to be possible for him to have flush draws. On some, it's not going to be possible for him to have 2 pair like this. On some, it's going to be very unlikely for him to have sets on some boards. But essentially, your play should vary on different boards. You shouldn't just be auto bet folding second pair on every board. But that's not very important to the theme of this video. So we're looking at his check raising range here, and I guess I'll get to what is more important in this video in a little bit. But it has all of his monsters, his strong made hands, which is top pair top kicker, top pair good kicker, then his medium strength made hands, top pair weak kicker, second pair overpair to the second card, all of his monster draws. We're giving him 75% of his regular draws, which is 8 to 9 out draws. I don't know why I called them regular draws. I guess just what I think of when I think of draws as a default. And then we'll give him half of his weak draws. So half the time he's actually going to float with some of his gutters, and the other half the time he's going to check raise them, which is a good play when considering that the rest of his range is kind of like top heavy and strong. We take a look at our hand against that range, and you'll see that we're about 27%, a little less than 27%. In addition to that, we do have position, but we also have reverse implied odds. And he's going to be able to bluff us occasionally or value bet us occasionally, given the way the board runs out. So I think honestly, against this range, it's pretty close spot, and we probably want to end up folding. It's not really that important. What's important is that when I tell you, you just fold this hand. You say, what can I do? It seems like I'm not really exploiting him. So here's his tendency. He check raises fairly often, and it's strongish and balanced. So what can we do about it? Well, we fold weak hands. And we pot control with some marginal hands. So maybe 10-6 suited, we wanted to pot control and check back the flop. I think that depends a lot on his turn and river tendencies, and we're not going to get into, but it's definitely a viable option. So we'll pot control with some made hands. We'll pot control with some draws that don't want to be check raised by a range that's difficult to play against. And that's most of what we do. And you say, well, it doesn't seem like we're doing much to fight back. It seems like his tendency is not that exploitable. So maybe it is a good strategy to check raise kind of unpolarized and often like he is. And I mean, the answer is no. I don't think it is. First of all, I should point out that just folding against a range very often is a form of exploiting it. If somebody's never bluffing rivers, you exploit that by folding. But in this case, it doesn't feel like we're doing much. We want to be fighting back more. So in order to do that, we have to think about the impact of his check raising range on his other ranges. So let's look here at hands that could check call the flop. We have all of his monsters. We have his strong made hands, weak made hands, medium strength made hands. Some weak made hands like bottom pair, pocket pairs lower than the second board card. Obviously, all of his draws very strong to very weak. and then some high card hands, ace high, king high, trying to get to showdown. And here I have highlighted in red all of the hands that he's check raising. In yellow are the hands that are left in his check calling range. So these are hands that do check call the flop, and because he's raising so many of these hands, they're out of his check calling range. And actually, if you think about it, what we're left with in his check calling range, it's basically weak made hands, so bottom pair are pretty much equivalent to bottom pair. A quarter of his flush draws or open enders, half of his gutters, and then all of his ace high and most of his king high type hands. All the king high he doesn't fold, but we'll say he's always calling with ace high, often calling with king high, just because he feels like I mean, people do that. That's fine, and he needs to be calling occasionally, otherwise he's just check folding so often. And when you think about a range like this, it should become kind of obvious what we want to do about it. So here, his check call range is extremely weak. So what are we going to do? Well, when he check calls, we're going to bet turns and rivers, both very thinly for value and with lots of air and draws. And we also want to slightly strengthen our c-betting range. And the reason for this is, I believe if you look at the ranges we're giving him on a HUD, he's going to have kind of low fold to c-bet stat. But obviously, depending on how light he's calling down on the turn and river, players like this, and I've encountered some players like this, they're very often calling stations. In general, to make this strategy work, they kind of have to be making some light calls, and because of that, it feels like they're calling very often on future streets, but they don't have very strong hands on future streets. And what I like to do against them is basically be two-barreling almost all the time and three-barreling very often. But I need to take out some of my one-barreling hands. Like, I don't want to be two-barreling with just like two unders and no outs. Just because, they still will show up with hands that can call the turn and show up with hands that can call the river. So I actually, since this player it's not very profitable to kind of like one-barrel him, I take out a lot of my one-barreling hands and just kind of give up with them, or occasionally delayed c-bet, and basically just c-bet, not just, but mostly c-bet with hands that I'm going to be barreling with at least one more time. But against a player like this, you can be barreling with like almost any 4-out draw to second pair, as I have here. So like any kind of overcard hand, any kind of like backdoor draw with some overs to second pair, things like that. And so let's look at just a quick hand example. So here we are against the same player, and we open the button, this time with Jack-7 of diamonds. And we get the same flop, Queen-6-3, 2 diamonds. Now this is a hand, like I was talking about, that still falls within the range of hands that have enough outs to two-barrel. First of all, on any diamond, we obviously have a very profitable two-barrel, but also we have 2 overs to second pair, and since a lot of his check calling range is going to consist of ace highs, king highs, and bottom pair, occasionally some weak second pair hands, those outs are very often good. So we're going to go ahead and c-bet against this player. Obviously, just if he check raises, we're probably going to have to fold. Obviously, you can mix it up occasionally. And the turn's a 9. Not really likely to have hit him. Even if he has a hand like King Jack, he's going to have trouble calling the turn. And really, if you think about his flop calling range, like we talked about, you usually find yourself with an insanely profitable two-barreling opportunity here when he has every ace high, most king highs, every bottom pair. I mean, if he wants to call with bottom pair, we have 6 outs. Usually we have 6 outs against ace high and king high, and obviously we can decide to bluff rivers with a lot of those hands as well. But basically, by check raising flops so often and so unpolarized, he has, made it very difficult to play against his flop check raise range, but he's made it extremely profitable to barrel against his check calling range. And so if we had just focused on what his check raising range was and what we wanted to do as a strategy against his check raising range, sure, we could have come up with something and figured out a good range to call against his check raising range, to 3-bet both for value and occasionally with some bluffs against his 3-betting range, or sorry, his check raising range. But we really would have found that there's not a whole lot of edge to be gained there. We're basically trying to fight back with raise any button and c-bet the majority of our range. So we're fighting with a very weak range against a pretty strong range and one that's well balanced. But if we had just left it there, I think we wouldn't have gained much of an edge on this opponent. But when you take it further and realize what his check raise range does to his check calling range, now we have an opponent that is very easy to play against and very profitable to play against, because we're basically going to be picking up so many pots on the turn and river. And if instead of Jack 7 we have 9-8 here, we have like an extremely easy 3-barrel for value. And even Ace 6 against his range, basically he's going to be calling us with worse than Ace 6 unless he has like 9-8 of spades and didn't check raise the flop. Essentially, we just have so many hands that we can barrel with, both for value and as bluffs. And it's really tough for him to do anything about it with such a weak range and us having such a wide value range as well as a wide bluffing range. It's really tough for him to fight back. So I realize now that I've breezed through this video pretty quickly. It's probably of my PowerPoints. I've had more slides in this one than in any of the others, but I think the reason for that is that the concept itself is pretty simple, and one that's not too difficult to understand or too difficult to explain. But nonetheless, I think it's really important. And first of all, I think that in poker, the ability to recognize your opponent's tendencies and leaks, and then adjust, your overall game plan, adjust the way you play every specific hand to those tendencies and leaks. It's really what poker's about. Then secondly, noticing your opponent's tendencies and leaks and thinking about how you're going to adjust to it is also how you know that you have an edge in a match, and how you can be confident that you're doing something right and your opponent's doing something wrong. I think that if you're sitting down playing somebody heads up, and after an hour you don't really notice they're doing anything unusual, or you don't really have much of a read on them and much of a plan other than playing your standard game, I think that you either don't have an edge, or you don't have nearly as much of an edge as you could, or you're just not really doing things right. I think that a lot of players that I've come into contact with who play, like for example, multi-table 6-max, and with the exception of like using a HUD and looking at some pre-flop stats, don't really adjust their game to each of their opponents. I think those are players that, I'm sure a lot of them eke out a win rate, but those are players that I think aren't going to progress very much and aren't going to move up, and aren't really like learning. They've kind of just developed a system and are playing, and that's not really what high-level poker's about. We did only get into one specific hand, really, and one specific concept or range that we talked about, which was somebody's flop check raising range and its effect on their flop check calling range, and what we want to do about it. And that was also a pretty obvious example, or a more simple example, and there are many others. But the moral of the story here is to think about their range, and all of their ranges really. And if somebody's doing something often, I think a lot of people's instinct is, okay, well, they're doing this often. What do I do when they do this? But like I guess we went over here, you also have to think about what do you do when they don't do this, and what does
their range for doing this mean about their other ranges? And it can be more complex than simply flop check raise versus flop check call. I mean, even in this specific example, you could look at it as, here's his flop check raising range. Let's think about what that means about his flop check calling range. Now let's think about what that means about his turn check calling range and his turn check raising range after check calling, which actually his turn check raising range should be almost non-existent, given the strength of his flop tendencies. And then obviously from there you go to his river tendencies based on his turn tendencies, which are based on his flop tendencies. And there are a lot of other ways it can work. And actually, I guess we'll get into a few right now, not as in depth as not with hand examples. But this is actually something I think that's really important. This is a way that I like to kind of test myself, and I think it's a very important way to test yourself and practice, I guess, away from the tables, as well as a very important way to test a student if you're coaching, or test a friend, or really get an idea of how your friend or student is doing, or how well they're thinking about the game. Basically, take a tendency and ask them what they're going to do about it. And answers can be extremely long and in depth, and should be extremely long and in depth, depending on the tendency. But here, and it doesn't have to be necessarily like a compound thing like this, where we're taking a certain range, what we do about it, then what it does to another range, and what we do about that. It could just be, like the simplest example is, hey, he's not bluffing rivers. What should we do? Well, we fold when he bets. That's a very obvious one. But it can be simple like that. And then obviously, the more complex you get, the more interesting it gets. So here are a few examples. If we're playing against an opponent who check raises the river with impetus, meaning he has the lead, he bet the turn, often and balanced, what can we do against it? Well, when faced with the turn check or river check raise, there's not a lot we can do against it. He is doing it balanced. He has a lot of strong hands, as well as a lot of his bluffs, or some weak-made hands turned into bluffs. Basically, we just do our best to hand read and make some calls, make some folds, decide when we have enough value to make a 3-bet, or when it's a good 3-bet bluff opportunity. And then obviously we could, check back a few more rivers against this opponent than against someone who doesn't check raise the river at all. But more importantly, what does it do to another range? Well, now his river betting range will contain a lot fewer big hands. I shouldn't have said less. That's improper, I believe. If he's taking a lot of his monsters and semi-monsters and check raising the river, then his river betting range doesn't have many of those in it. So either he's not going to be betting the river very often, or he's going to be betting the river mostly for thin value and with bluffs. So what can you do about that against that range? Since he has some of his stronger hands taken out, he might be bluffing more often, proportionally. So first of all, you can call the river more often, and obviously you need to get more specific reads about how often he's bluffing. But then more importantly, you can raise rivers more often with both bluffs and thin value. One reason you want to kind of shy away from bluff raising river as much as, in addition to them hero calling, you're going to run into some very strong hands that are obviously going to call you. And actually, that's kind of more of an effect on how thinly you can go for value. So if you're worried about running into monsters, you don't go for river raises for value as thinly, and then consequently you can't bluff as often because you just don't have that many hands that are capable of raising for value. But now once he's taken a lot of his monsters out of his river betting range, we can start raising more thinly for value, and because of that, we can start raising more often with our bluffs as well. And he's not going to be able to 3-bet us very often because he's not going to have that many monsters. He's not going to be able to call us as often because he won't have as many monsters. Or he's going to start hero calling, and then we'll just get him with the thin value. Second tendency we have here is our opponent 3-bets unpolarized and often. So we're thinking, let's say, like top 20% of hands in a heads-up match. What can we do against it? Well, we can fold. We can actually do some things about it. In this case, we fold some flops in 3-bet pots on some higher card boards, just because he's going to contain a lot more broadways, things like that. And I would say we can 4-bet for value more often. What I mean by that is I wouldn't slow play aces or kings or ace king as often, because A hand like Ace King, first of all, is going to have him dominated much more often, and obviously, it depends on his tendencies, but he's going to have a lot more hands in his 3-betting range that are kind of viable 5-bet jam hands, since he's going to have like all those Ace Jack offsuit and those King Queen suited type hands that can talk himself into jamming. But then we can look at what it does to another range. Well, now his preflop calling range is not going to have those high card hands, not going to have those Broadway hands because he's 3-betting them. So obviously what we can do about that is these high card boards, we can be in single raise pots, we can attack the high card boards more often. And then I just wrote keep his range in mind, which is a simplification, but basically throughout the hand, his range is a lot less balanced now, and it doesn't contain a lot of high cards. It contains a lot more speculative hands. And so, throughout the hand, just keep that in mind and make your bets and raises and calls accordingly. And just like have his range in mind, basically, is what that means. This is like an example of, when he's 3-betting that range, it's tough to play against, but it makes his other range, his preflop calling range, a lot easier to play against. And finally, we have an opponent who checks back turn with some strong hands, both to catch some river bluffs, induce some river bluffs, and also to pot control. So what can you do when he checks back the turn? Not a ton. We do have to worry a little bit more about getting value cut, or value cutting ourselves, and then also, bluffs not working quite as often because he has a stronger range than we're used to. So I guess we slightly tighten up our value betting range and our bluffing range, so we just have a smaller river betting range. But otherwise, there's not a lot we can do to exploit it. It's actually pretty tough to exploit. It makes it strengthens his river checkback range and makes it tougher to play against. And that's actually like basically another concept, or kind of comes with the concept that I'm getting across, or trying to get across in this video, that when you want to strengthen a certain range or make a certain range tougher to play against, what you're going to end up doing is weakening a different range and making a different range easier to play against, and that's kind of true in all of these cases. So here, what does it do to his other range? Well, now his turn betting range is either weakened or it's smaller. So really one of two things. Either he continues to like semi-bluff pretty often, like a normal player, in which case he doesn't have as many strong hands, so his betting range contains more bluffs and semi-bluffs than usual. Or he realizes that he's not betting as many strong hands, and so he checks back some of his weaker semi-bluff hands, and maybe some of his stronger semi-bluff hands, and just has a low turn bet frequency. So obviously there are a couple of things that could have happened. What we do about it depends on which of those is true. If he's still betting all of his bluffs and semi-bluffs, we can start calling the turn more often, potentially raising the turn more often, because he's taking out a lot of his top pair type hands out of his turn betting range, and has a weaker turn betting range. Or if he doesn't have a weakened turn betting range, just a smaller one, meaning he's, like I said, checking back more often with his weaker hands to balance out the fact that he's checking back some of his stronger hands, we can call the flop more often because we're not facing two barrels very often. We get to showdown. And also we're going to want to slow play the flop less often, for obvious reasons. I mean, he's not going to be betting the turn very often, both for thin value and with bluffs. So we're not going to be able to get that turn check raise in or induce that 3-barrel that we want with hands that we're slow playing. And these are just, I guess, a few more examples, and there are many more that you can come up with. But I just wanted to, point out that it's not just I didn't just come up with one strange tendency and make a whole video about it. It's about a bigger concept. But that should wrap up the video. As always, and especially I think with philosophy videos, I'm eager to hear your questions and see if I can clarify anything, expand on anything that I missed. So please, any questions, comments, feedback, things like that are very appreciated. This might end up being a bit of a short video, so I apologize for that, but I really don't think anything longer than this about this concept would have just been rambling. So yeah, let me know what you think, and I will see you guys next week. This is Phil Galfond for BlueFirePoker.com. Take care, guys.